So we've been dealing with lots of different categories in musical interpretation, from four-bar phrases and direction and what belongs to what and tempo and character and rubato and all those issues. And there's one category which I've left to last, and that's harmony. Harmonic development and analysis, and that's the category we're going to do today. Now, when I was a music student studying cello in Italy, in Florence, I had a teacher called Mr. Fragapani. And Mr. Fragapani, he insisted on being called Mr. Fragapani. You have to roll the R like that. He taught me harmony and some counterpoint and these other things. I was 15, 16, 17 years old. And he taught me that under each chord in the music, you put a number, 1, 2, first inversion of 2, whatever. And we did that, and I learned to do that, and I became quite proficient at analyzing the harmony, and that went along very happily. And then I went to Germany, and they did the same thing there. And nobody ever suggested there was a connection between the chords. It was just a question of identifying. We had to know what they were in order to be good students. Nobody ever suggested there was any connection between what we did with Mr. Fragapani and what I did with Mr. Casado. We were completely separate. One was about playing and music and interpretation, and the other was about harmony. And then, as you may remember, I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge to study music. I went to London University to study English literature. Right, so that became my main focus. And in 1960, which I worked out was about 60 years ago, I came to Boston and met my brother-in-law, Neil Rudenstein. You remember the class at Harvard in Humanities 6, and that sparked my interest in poetry and in looking at poetry in a new way. Because at London University, where I studied English literature, they had also essentially just marked at the bottom of the page what the chords were. I'm of course not literally, but it was rather formal. And what I learned in that class at Harvard with Neil was that the language of the music of poetry and all the elements that we talked about when we talked about that Frost poem. So then the following year, that's now 1965, I went to New York. My wife, Patricia, a great pianist, great musician, wanted to study with Leonard Shure, great pianist. And I can tell you more about him, and I will at another time. It was a very powerful, very influential year. And I sat in on all those lessons, and in fact even played at some of them. Even though I was a cellist, we worked together, trios and sonatas, and it was a wonderful thing. And he told me about Heinrich Schenker. Now, I had never heard the name Heinrich Schenker, and I was a 27-year-old professional musician, had never heard the name Heinrich Schenker. And he sent me off to a gentleman called Ernst Oster. And I repeat that and say Ernst Oster, O-S-T-E-R, because every time he called, he would say, "Here's Oster, O-S-T-E-R." So every time I hear the name, that's what I hear. And he was my Schenker teacher. And I went on Saturday mornings, and the person who went before me was Richard Good, and the person who came after me was Peter Serkin. So clearly this was something of importance, and I gather that Mario Pariah had also been tremendously involved in studying this theory of musical interpretation. And I took lessons with him, and incidentally in the background were some great figures like Furtwängler, for instance, who became a tremendous follower of Schenker and supported him and paid for publications of his theories and so on. And then I brought Oster, O-S-T-E-R, to New England Conservatory, where he taught coming up from New York in order to do that. So he became a very important person in my life. And the essential idea of the Schenker approach, and in very simple terms, people made fun of it. Oh yes, that's 151, because what he did was he reduced, like a soup, or to the absolute essentials. And of course, if you reduce to the essentials a piece of Western music, whether it's a folk tune or a pop song or a sonata, you'll find tonic, dominant, tonic, and that's the essential. And so people make fun of Heinrich Schenker and said, oh yeah, 151, that's the reduction to the elements. But what he did most importantly was he distinguished the foreground from the middle ground and from the background. So the foreground is the piece as we know it, as we hear it. The background is the underlying harmonic structures, and the middle ground is that, and the background is the essential underlying structures. Now, in architectural terms, if you look around the room in which you're sitting, notice how many lines go downwards. If you have paintings on the wall or a mirror or a bookcase, those lines are all going down. And as you look, you'll see more and more lines going downwards. Now ask yourself this question: how many of those lines are holding up the roof? And immediately you realize that suddenly your attention from the mass to the middle to the essential goes quickly to the corners where the great events happen, the scaffolding that holds the roof up. That is the secret of Schenker's work. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a work of Schenker. I want to introduce you to a book which I like. It's called Schenker Analysis and Other Approaches, and that's very important because the Schenker people tend to be very dogmatic, and they tend to think it's the only way of approaching analysis, and it is not. And the nice thing about this particular book is that it brings in other approaches, other analytical approaches of the same pieces. And I'll show you what a Schenker graph looks like. That's a graph of a piece of music, and there's no way of knowing from looking at that graph what piece of music it is. It's just the essentials. And once you've seen that, you see this is a completely different way of looking at music. And when I was in between the time when I was in Boston studying at Harvard, I was also studying at Brandeis, and I had a wonderful situation at Brandeis. I've never mentioned this to you, what was going on there. I had a fellowship. It was a very, very generous fellowship. They would pay for anything that I wanted to do anywhere in the country. And I wanted to go to Brandeis to study string quartets with Robert Koff. Robert Koff was the founding second violin of the Juilliard Quartet. And the quartet consisted of him playing the second violin and me coaching from the cello. And every session I would come, I can't remember who the other two were, we would play a quartet, and I would have worked on it and studied it and analyzed it a little bit like I did in the Humanities 6 course, like with poetry, trying to find out. And he would constantly say, whenever I came up with something, he would say, "So what?" And I have it ringing in my ear, "So what?" Because what irritated him was I would come up with these analytical things and it wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't be for the performance, and that was what he was interested in. He was a great, great musician and a wonderful person. I could tell many stories about Robert Koff. He was very funny. He was the one who said to me one day, "Well, it's just like taking a scrambled egg on a walk on a string." That was his way. He had a very humorous, wonderful way. He was a great musician. And I learned playing quartets with him at Brandeis that actually the leader of a quartet is the second violin, because I felt his leadership at all times. Anyway, the "so what" is ringing in my ear, and now, having discovered the contribution of Schenker and that approach, I have a very good answer when he says, "So what?" But I didn't know about Schenker then. That was new. So this was it was a cataclysmic event for me to discover this man. Saturday morning I went to Oster, OSTER, and we studied. And one day we studied the saraband of the G major solo sonata of Bach. And this is my new copy, which Armin has just given to me. It's the most beautiful Bärenreiter version you open. Now look how beautiful that looks. And this is the saraband. This is all we're going to look at. Those 5 lines of music. Now I'll take that away, and what you will see here, what Dave's camera will come close on, is the piece of paper in which I analyze this with Ernst Oster, O-S-T-E-R, in his apartment. I think he took his apartment over from Palestrina. I don't think there had been anything in between. It was covered with books and scores to the ceiling. I mean, it was the most unholy mess. Anyway, we sat at the desk, and this is the actual paper, 60 years ago, or 56 years ago. I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but I want to analyze it with you. And sitting in my armchair here is Valida. And what I can imagine is this. Valida is a cherished colleague, great musician, and I can imagine her sitting in her library, if you can show, sitting in the comfortable armchair in her library, studying the Bach saraband before she plays it, because wise musicians don't play until they've studied. The first thing is to study and understand, and then to go to the instrument and play. So I've invited Valida to be here, and incidentally, I want to tell you there's a whole chapter here in this book by Oster, O-S-T-E-R. Here he is, here. You see Ernst Oster. Register and large-scale connections in, I don't know, some Chopin or Mozart, whatever. Okay. All right, now here we go. This is the beginning. Now, this is the first 4 bars, and you can see it here. This is the chords. That's the foreground of the music. That's the music as it. Just below it, you can see, in this Schenkerian reduction, you get this, and now this, which is that. That's the neighbor note, and the N beside it is the neighbor note. So all of this is a reduction of these 2 bars. So these 2 bars, that's one harmonic event, which in the Schenkerian style is reduced essentially to a G major chord with the 3rd at the top with an upper neighbor note, and the harmony developed like that. So that's a filling out of a chord. That's very similar to it's the same progression. Very easy to see. Now the next event is an F and a D, and that's in the 3rd bar. And those it comes from nowhere. It's not prepared. It's just out of nowhere. And then now you notice that the C has brackets around it, and the reason for that is the C doesn't actually appear, but it's assumed. And Schenker always did that. When a note was assumed, he put a parenthesis around it. So D, and this. So that's a harmonic cadence, and then. So now if you look at the second line, you got... And that's a reduction of the whole 4 bars at the beginning. If you look one line down, now he's reduced the D and F in parentheses to something apparently quite insignificant, because it's not part of a basic progression, and this, it's almost like a grace note, if you like, but the essential is okay. Now I want you to turn the page to the next page, or I'm going to turn the page, and this is bar 5. Now, the first note is an A, but if you look back to the previous thing, you've got... There is no A here, but it's here, all right? So that, but it's assumed. That's the same chord. So in the little design here, you've got an A and an F sharp in parentheses, although essentially it's just... That's the essence of it. And I wrote a little NB here, the B, G in measure 2. That's here. The measure 2, B, G, B, G. And the B, G in measure 4 are parallel. Right? It's the same figure. So far, very simple and not difficult to see. Now let's see what happens to that A. Goes to B, and then to C sharp and D. So the D at the top here is filled out with this harmonic event, and you see it here. But the D is essentially what this is a very simple shape there. And then it comes down to A. Now you're going to see what happens in the next bar, but let's just go back one more time. This is A, C, G, B. This is on an E minor chord. So in the large space, what Schenker did is he would put a line up like this on the A, cross it over here to the B, and then a line over there to the C sharp, and then to the D, which is there. The A is also important because that's the note on which it started. You notice that A there is connected, so that's why it has a large line over it, and this A and that A are the same A. This is simply filling it out. By now, in my lesson with Ernst Oster, O-S-T-E-R, my head was beginning to spin with excitement. And it happened week after week. I would come out of the lessons with him and I would meet Peter Serkin on the street, or I couldn't remember whether it was Peter or Richard Good. And I was always in a state, as if I'd taken a drug, because I was suddenly seeing connections and ways of thinking that I'd never, in all the years that I'd been a musician, I hadn't. And the notes here are added thing. We don't need to go into that at the moment. Let's go on with the fundamentals, because so far we've got, now, here we go to bar 5. But wait, 5. Okay, now comes bar 9. Bar 9 is this. Now you remember that the D in the previous bar, this is in bar 7. The D is still there. And so in the next bar, D, da, da, D, it becomes C many bars later. That's the Schenkerian idea. The C is holding up one side of the roof, and the C is holding up the next bit of the roof. You see how that goes. And so you start to take your head out of each individual chord, looking at it like this, and start seeing the long lines. And those of you who know me well as a musician, who've played in the orchestra, are very conscious. I keep on calling it one buttock playing, that feeling that you're sweeping your mind and your thought and your gestures over the bar lines to the next great event that the music is calling you to do. And that is a thrilling thing. So now that C natural resolves to B, but it's not G major. This is not a resolution. And we can go home. No, it's not. We're still in D major. And this is the fourth, the subdominant in G major. So this is where we're going. We're going to E minor. All right, so this is just passing there. Again, there's that C, B, C, B, C, B. Everywhere we look, it's C, B. And now E minor, and the E minor is the resolution of that D sharp, and of course this, that's filling now in the graph here. You see underneath, this is a Schenkerian graph. You see the C, G, D sharp, that's that D sharp. And E minor here, that's the second, the second two in and now here, and we're all in E minor. Okay, now that's bar 9, 10, 11, and 12. Right? We've reached E minor, which is clearly a very important part. Now let's just go back to the beginning of the piece. And this is a graph of how far we've got so far. Do you see that here? So there's the B, and you see it's already reduced more. The soup has already lost a lot of the vegetables. We're getting to the essence here. The vegetables are the decoration, the lines coming down, the paintings, and all the things that make up the full piece. You remember that going up to the D? There it is. I'm going to do it one more time so you can follow it. This is the beginning with the upper neighbor note, back to B, and this is the D which comes out of nowhere, and back to G, and now to the dominant of the fourth bar. You remember 4 bar with the repeat, D, 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 up to the D, beginning of the second half, and now there we are. And we're in bar 12, which is above. Do you see that there? Now suddenly there's a contrast between what happens on the surface and what's happening under the water, as it were. Now we go on from there to the last section, which is 13 and 14. Now at this point we left ourselves in E minor, and now we've got to get back from E minor to A and then back to G. Now this is how he does it. Now already it looks as though we're going to go to A minor. So that's and if you look at this graph, so the bass goes, and there's the B, C, B again. B, C, B again. It keeps coming back and coming back. And now here's the final section. This is the last 1, 2 bars. So we got. And now here is 2 suspensions. So in the graph here it's B, and now finally to G. At long last it's gone all the way down to G for the first time. So now going from the E minor, you remember the E minor, And now the two suspensions. And now look how he's reduced that in the top line here. B with the upper neighbor note C, and this little D, which is obviously not that important. Back to C, back to B, and A and G. So the whole thing is reduced essentially to B, C, B, C, B, C, B, A, G. The whole piece is a suspension of B and C and a little also D, and it doesn't resolve until the very end when it goes down to G. And this is a pure Schenkerian graph. You could see by looking at this, you couldn't possibly tell what piece it is, but that's the essential, the Ursatz, the original scaffolding of the building, if you like. What Ernst Oster told me was that this chord, the 1/6 chord, was absolutely essential for you couldn't just do, but you actually had to include that crucial chord as part of it. And there are two notes here which I think are worth saying. It's inadequate to do the kind of analysis where the C in bar 4, that's at the beginning, and the C in bar 4, that's this C, is considered to be related or reminiscent of the C in bar 2 or in bar 1. The point in the Schenkerian world is that it is structurally related. It is structurally, not just a nice memory or a decoration, but it's structural the way that in a room, without it, the roof would fall down. You get that? So this is the world in which he's living. And what he says at the end here is CB, these two notes, is central to the whole piece. The final resolution in the tension is where it finally resolves down to G at the end of the piece. So the concept that he passed on to me that day was that there was a tension between B and C, B and C, B and C. Yes, a D comes in, but basically B and C, B and C, and finally that tension is resolved by falling to G. What I was saying to Alfonso earlier today, we were talking about this, what the effect it's had on me over all these years is to make me think in larger lines and on the whole to tend towards slightly faster tempi, because instead of getting engaged and indulging in the moment, I'm always thinking or trying, I should say, to think of, yes, but where is it going? The B, the C, the B, the C. You know, it's that tension of suspension like a ball on the top of a fountain. How does it keep up there? And what does it feel like when finally it falls to the G? That sense of release is what the piece essentially is about. In the rather indulgent, romantic style of playing this music that came in with Casals, who discovered the piece. You know, he discovered them in the exercise compartment of the musical shop in Barcelona where he was living. He thought they were exercises, studies, and he unraveled and discovered the beauty of them over 12 years before he even agreed to play one in public. But he brought to it a romantic sensibility. He approached it like Schumann, like with tremendous love and unbelievable understanding and engagement, but at the same time with a feeling of that every moment, every note, everything was special, because in the romantic mentality, every petal on every flower means something, and you have to give it its full attention. And you can write a whole poem just on the petals of a flower. That's not the classical Baroque mentality. There it's more architectural. And here the consciousness that suddenly was revealed to me in this amazing conversation with Oster, O-S-T-E-R. Forgive me for doing that, but my brain is literally every time he called, he would say, and my Patricia would pick up the phone, hello, Oster, O-S-T-E-R. So I can't almost say the word, but I have great reverence for him and for his. He was a difficult man because he was so out of connection with reality, with the world. I mean, this is where he lived. And when you went into his room on Saturday morning, it was like into a holy of holies, just to contemplate the greatness of this music, which he revered. And it didn't matter which Chopin or Bach or Beethoven. And he showed me the great book of the analysis of the Eroica Symphony, the whole Eroica Symphony, analyzed by Schenker. It's an entire book. With this kind, we're just looking at 16 bars. He was looking at the whole symphony. So it was a heady world, and for somebody of my age who'd never even heard the name Heinrich Schenker, it was a kind of a miracle. And I immediately ran to Gunther Schuller and I said, "You've got to bring him to Boston." And he did. He hired him, and Bruce Kopach told me he studied in his class at NEC and so on. So now, let's see what we can do. What influence would this have on a musician playing it? And so what I've done, because you can't play from the scruffy bits of paper, these are the same bits of paper that I had with me in the class in 60 years ago. Is that funny? Almost 60 years ago. Still happily. Now, so I've made a copy here of and I'll have it, you'll have it here, and I'm going to give this to Valida. And without, this is not a class, it's not a lesson, it's just sharing, as one might do, knowledge with a colleague. And let's see what happens. And she'll play, and I'll give her this sheet, which essentially outlines what we have done. And if you just bring the camera here a moment, Dave, that if you can see what we have here, this is the B at the beginning, and this is its repeat. You see, this is the C that is not really there, but it's in brackets. And this is the CB there, and then the A, which is the beginning of the line up to D. This is the B, C sharp, D. This is the D connected to the C at the beginning of the second half. Again, CB. This is E minor, that crucial arrival point. And now we've got to get from E minor to the 2, which is A minor in G major. That's the second. And that's the climax of the piece. And then from there, this is the first inversion that Oster felt was so important. This double suspension, and then so Valida has moved from her armchair in the library to her cello, and armed with this insight and information, she's going to play with a repeat, but only it's very interesting because the second repeat sign isn't here. Let me just see whether that's okay. There must be a mistake. Yeah. Now, I just want to say one thing before we start. It's very important to understand that this is not the only way of approaching the piece. It's not as though it's right. It's just a way of looking. And two Schenker scholars could come up with two different interpretations of the piece. It's not as if it's only one, this is the truth and everybody has to just give up. No, not at all. It's just like putting on a particular pair of glasses and looking, and this is what we see. So should we try? Welcome to the... Just out of interest, did you have Schenker in your youth? Did you?
Well, I did indirectly, because everything you're saying just brings me back to my great French cello teacher that I to this day still really respect so highly. and he only approached music from that angle.
Really?
And he would, the first thing he would do is go to the piano and start showing us all the harmony, because he says unless you understand the harmony, you cannot play it.
But this is more than understanding the harmony, because we did that too. We had to name every chord.
Right.
You know, and put a little 2 under it and a first inversion of the. But what this is doing is something quite different. It's saying that's the name of the chord, but it's just decoration in something much bigger. So that's what the revelation was for me.
And he called it the harmonic rhythm.
Oh,
so there is like, you know, the progression.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so yeah, that was actually.
Okay, let's see what happens. And we're all going to follow. And Dave is going to keep. Can you keep this, Dave, in your view so that we can see, so they can follow this, right? Great. Okay, here we go. Well, what a beautiful, beautiful performance, and a revelation of a whole different way of playing Bach, actually. And very interesting, because it brings up another whole discussion, which is, are the notes that Bach gave us actually only just a blueprint for improvisation? And the world is divided, and you're definitely a fine, I've never heard you play this, and you're a very fine exponent of that style, which is rather rare. You can't see any of the volumes that have been written with these decorations. But it's a very beautiful thing. For me, but it's very personal, for me, the improvisations feel like a distraction, and I'll tell you why. Because, well, two reasons. One is it's a dance, and I kept on feeling that the movement of the dance was being interrupted. And the other thing is I was desiring that D to go to the C, and by the time it had got there, I'd lost the impetus altogether. So here's a very interesting thing. Would you be willing to come over to this? And I do, again, I want to say this again very clearly. We're on very delicate ground here. Nobody really knows because we haven't talked to Bach. I think Bach would have loved your performance. That I'm pretty sure of. I suspect that everybody in our group was fascinated by it. It sounded more like Couperin to me than it did like Bach, frankly, with that kind of constant stopping and little interruptions and so on. I think there's something. Bach was a North German. He was Lutheran. He was severe. He didn't allow sensuality into his world. It was separate. You remember we talked about that with César Franck, that in the French style they gave sensuality and spirituality came together, not in Bach. In Bach they were separate. So I would think for me this world is more... sense of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And for my feeling is, in order to make these long lines so that this B is heard, finish. That's one chord. And now they're parallel. So this you see, it's very interesting.
I know it's a long conversation.
It's a long conversation, right. And it's a great conversation.
It is.
Yeah,
and part of me feels like this is an opportunity. I came up with those yesterday, by the way.
You what?
I came up with those yesterday. Those ornaments.
Wow.
But I think that's part of what's interesting with the repeats.
Wonderful.
To change it up a bit, but I'm not necessarily...
Well, let's see whether you can keep the dance.
Sure.
Keep a feeling of the dance so that when you get to the end of the first part, we are invited to the next step in the dance.
And you still would like me to try with them?
I don't care what you do. I'd be fascinated. Whatever you do. Okay. I mean, this is why... I mean, this is not a lesson, you understand? Sure, it's not a masterclass. It's we're all students. I mean, if only people could understand that. We're all students. Right. And whether we're old like me or young like some of the kids in the orchestra, we're all studying, and nobody knows because we didn't. And would Bach have loved that? Well, sure, but he may not have known about it. It's like if Beethoven had had an orchestra like Ravel, would he have written different music? I mean, that's an interesting subject.
Right.
You know, and why didn't he use the tuba in the Seventh Symphony when the because you could never hear the bass there because the orchestra's making so much noise, and so why not put a tuba there? Well, maybe not.
Right.
But those are the discussions.
Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely.
so let's try and see if we can keep and think of this Schenkerian idea of the B, C, B, C, B being suspended. So when you finally come down to should we try that? You know, there's another thing I would say to you, again, not as a lesson but as a comment. There's something very straight about Bach's rhythm. It's the kind of cosmic rhythm, and this is a little bit, in my view, too romantic. So if you can just be very simple with it, because the rhythms are so beautiful in themselves, they don't need to be changed. Should we try once again? Go on. And here it comes, the siege. I meant to go on because I'm still holding the yes. Bravo for being flexible and playing in a different way. And something else came out this time. First of all, the dance, the feeling of the elevation of the dance, and the steps, the feeling of motion, because the other way of playing tends to slow everything down, make it almost immobile. And this is definitely not immobile music. This is music of the dance. And the other thing is that it brought out the line of that C, B, C, B, C. And when we finally reached the G, it was a sense of, we made it. So, wonderful. Let's go to another piece, because we just have time to do this. We have the D minor prelude, because I tell you what I did in my life. When I left New York and came back here and started conducting, I stopped studying and working in the Schenkerian manner. I started teaching at the conservatory, and I didn't. When I had my interview at the New England Conservatory, I gave a class, and the piece I did was this very piece. And I remember Bob Kogan was teaching there. He was head of composition there, and he was absolutely thrilled with the idea that somebody would come, a cello teacher, because it was a cello job, teaching at the conservatory. I had 16 cello students at the conservatory. That time I was the only cellist in town, so I taught yo-yo and all the cellists in town I came. But anyway, this is the piece. He was so thrilled at the idea that a cellist would be so interested in bringing theory into the lesson, into the teaching and study of performance, because that was rather rare at that time. This is a long time ago now. So I gave up doing full-scale Schenker analysis. It's too difficult, too complicated, too stressful. and too divorced, I felt, from my life as a musician and as a performer. But what I did do is I kept what I called the Schenkerian approach, the what did I call it? With the Schenker principle. I called it the Schenker principle. And so what I've done here with you is lovely, is we can look at the D minor. Do you have the D?
Yes, I have it.
Right. And you have the
this one, right?
yeah, right. And I don't. Yeah, here I do.
Do you want
Here it is. Here it is. So this is the D minor suite. And what I've done is I've done with it what we had already done, but on a much more simple level. What I've done is taken the essences of the piece. So it starts on D, then obviously the bass goes down to C sharp, and then the C sharp resolves only all the way over here, right? So the bass here is D, do, 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 do. That essentially is a D minor, and the upper voice. So this chord, do, do, dee, dee, do, is the same as do, do, do. It's another form of it, and it's a way of saying I'm in D minor, just as this says I'm in G major. This says the third bar is redundant in the sense it could go. It could go back to D minor, but it gets intensification by. And I would say that if you can make the end of the bar parallel to the beginning of it, you'll make that absolutely clear. So can we just try that from the beginning, only as far as the D?
Sorry, Ben, what do you mean by make it parallel?
Well, this is parallel to a da 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 da.
Oh, okay.
Da da D and da 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 da.
Okay, yes.
Do you see how they're the same thing? So very simple, making the presentation of those elements. Should we try it?
Sure. So just play from the beginning.
Good, it's gorgeous. Everything you do is gorgeous. Can I suggest that you trust the music a little bit more to be simply present what it is? It's this. It's such a simple idea, and it's a long way to go. And I think the my point is that everybody in the world could follow that. Everybody. A farmer in Ohio, an African prince, it doesn't matter who you are. You play that and they say, I understand that. Because it's such a simple musical idea. Now let's go on and see what happens. Because that essentially is a step down to B flat. And so you're saying to the listener, the B flat is being held here, and now goes to A. And to G. Now, instead of going on, if it went on, it would go to F, right? But it's too early. He wants to do something else in between. So, to F. So essentially what he's done since the beginning, D, C sharp, D, B flat, A, G. That's it. That's it. It's such a simple, beautiful, it's like an arch in a building, 12 bars of music. So would you do that, and you had a group of children or African princes or farmers in Ohio, and you were trying to tell them the story of the notes and how they reveal themselves? Would you do from the beginning all the way to the F? Special and tender and beautiful and artistic way, and it's clear. The main thing is that it be clear. Now let's find out what happens next. F. Here's the F. Do we have that? Are you with me? Yeah, F. F sharp. G. G sharp. A. B. C, D, D, E. So we've gone from F to F sharp to G sharp to A to B to C to D to E. Now E is an arrival point because it's the dominant of A. And that's a good place to be going because the piece is in has got to eventually come back to D minor, and so A is a useful place to be, but it's too early to arrive at the dominant. So he says at this point, wait a minute, I'm going to wander about here because I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go. Okay, it's time to get to A minor. Now, A minor, because what we're looking for is A major. So let's go down lower, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C sharp, to D, E, to F, G, and D. We got there. Finally. That's the destination. From the beginning to there is the destination. So it starts on a D, goes to F major in bar 13, and now arrives at A in bar 30. And if you listen to those three notes, they're the first three notes of the piece. And he's gone on half the journey of the piece. Yeah. So would you do that? And let's do it in a sense together, because this is not personal. This is an architectural journey.
Can I point something out that I think is fine? In the midst, it's a detail, but if you go to measure 21, there's a scale of D, A, B, like a downward scale. I just think that in the midst of all of this.
So from D.
Going scale in the midst of it.
Very nice, very nice. But what I think the thing that's beautiful, and let's bring it out, it shouldn't have arrived in A that soon. So there is a quality of wandering, because it's the bass, and then it goes to there. Gorgeous. Let's do it from the beginning. We're going all the way to measure 30 from the beginning. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Here we go. Can I just say one thing? Since later on, we mustn't be too slow. So should we get that tempo that we're going to use later? I found it so clear, so sensible, so easy to follow, so much the drama of what Bach. Now what happens is very interesting, because what we've reached is the dominant, and therefore the question is, what happens to this dominant? This is the dominant. Now, would you play from that very place? And let's find out what happens to that dominant, because eventually it's got to resolve, right? It's got to resolve. So the question is, what happens now?
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to say something.
You carry on. Thing, because that A never gets resolved. Even when it goes to D minor here, it's not D minor, it's part of a process. It's a pedal note that goes over the whole thing. And I would suggest you're going to think about it, because these are all just thoughts. Since it doesn't resolve, don't let it resolve. So if you think bar 30, that's actually like a fortepiano, because it's an elision. We've talked about that before. It's the end of the previous music and the beginning of a new one. So I would say, and that G sharp is going to A. Do you see how it's not a resolution? So to A and then to A. To A. pause while the sound goes to the back of the cathedral and comes back. Isn't that an amazing thing?
You can tell he was an organist.
What's that?
You can tell he was an organist.
He was an organist, exactly. In a church. In a church. Yeah.
Right?
So would you do that once? Do it once together. Give yourself up to the idea, and let's see from starting in the middle. Incidentally, the middle beat of the middle bar of the beat. The piece is 60 bars long. This is the middle beat of the 30th bar. Is that chance? I don't think so.
Sorry, you want me to...
Well, bar 30.
Yes.
The second beat
right.
is where it begins.
Right. Yes, yeah.
That's where it begins, in the middle of the piece. Isn't
here?
that a thrilling thing? So start on the low A,
okay.
not on the C sharp,
okay.
and then let's build it, and let's feel, and let's see everybody. If the people in the audience can feel that sense of accumulation of billows of sound around the cathedral, always lifting up, because everything in the Baroque style lifts upwards to God. That's the secret for the glory of God. That's what he's doing. It's not personal. It's not about an individual flower, but about a grand architectural motion, like a huge arc in a cathedral. Should we try from there? Can I just suggest that when you get to the G sharp, he goes to A, always back to A, back to A, back to A once again. To me, you know, there's a certain moment in my life I decided I didn't want to be a cellist anymore. I wanted to be a conductor, because the size of the music, the number of people in an orchestra, it just pulls you with this force to make a bigger statement. And that's what you just did. It was beautiful. Now the question is, what happens now? Because is it resolved? No, it isn't. So I would ask you to reconsider the tradition that was brought in by Casals, who always played this beautifully, so as if it was a beautiful, tender little moment in a Schumann piece. Rather, it's just a continuation. That chord is the same as this chord. Nothing has happened harmonically at all yet, but now. And finally the resolution is there to D minor. And now what happens? To E, to F, to G, Isn't that an amazing thing? So the end, I mean, it's something to think about. I would love to hear that the A continues here. And then when you get to this chord, it reminds us of this. But now, same thing. And now comes the final bars. And this cadence at the end is 12 bars, like the beginning is 12 bars, and in the middle is this huge arc. And I've drawn a little sign here. Do you see this? An arc like this?
Yes,
yes.
Yes.
That's the architectural mentality that Bach was working with. It's not chance that that A comes in the middle of the middle bar of this thing. So should we just try that? Just see whether we can pull it off from here. And now you go on, and you let that sound go to the back of the hall, back of the cathedral, and then go on. Try. I would make that arrival much more intense, because you've kept this. Think how many bars you've done this. Where does it resolve? That chord resolves. Now quietly. Make that as calm as possible. It's very hard to do it without. So would you do me a favor? We have just time before our beloved Dave has to run off to another job. What we're going to do together, you see, there's a sense in which I believe this is not personal. This is not my interpretation, but more what's going on here and how can we be part of it? It's almost like a cosmic motion that we join. And so the idea of doing it together is not so silly, because it's not. The only place where I disagreed with you, where I felt, is that when we got to this, it just took too much time, because I wanted. When we finally got to the A unencumbered, that was something that otherwise it was just. So let's go from the beginning, and when we get to this, keep it fortissimo, maybe on the A string, so that it keeps intense, because Bach wasn't thinking, oh, they'll do it on the D string. He was thinking of what happens to that chord. And then when we get to this, let's make everybody feel that moment we've arrived at last, and then all we have to do. Should we do it? All right. From the beginning. This is going to be so exciting. Are you ready? Bravo.
Sorry,
It's great. Because it's very interesting about that, because it's so long, those chords are so long that actually a lot of people, including you just now, left out a whole beat. Because when you think it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. I once had a very distinguished dinner guest, Jacques-Louis Monod. Do you know who that is? Great musician from France, and a friend of Boulez, and he taught at the conservatory. He came for dinner one night, and he came to my house, and he saw this piece on the piano, and he sat down, and he started trying to work out the improvisations for those chords, and he took about an hour of my cooked dinner, which I prepared for him, and he couldn't make it work. He said, just play chords.
Okay, so we'll do it again.
Look, This has been a beautiful thing. I mean, we're just short up to the time when Dave has to leave. It's been glorious, because I'm not forcing you at all to change or to do anything of the kind. I think there is my reaction to your approach, beautiful, artistic, arresting, engaging, is that the simplicity of Bach's mentality, which was a nonconformist North German Lutheran mentality, is undermined by this constant pulling rubato freedom. The only time for freedom in Bach is when you're pointing out the movement of the notes, of the journey of the notes. Anything else is like an indulgence, and it can be very beautiful. I'm just saying the simplicity that I believe we're looking for, and that comes out in these great arcs of sound. The more we can draw attention of the listener to that, the better it is. But there's obviously many ways of doing it, and I think everybody who's listening today will be touched and impressed and moved by your approach and the imagination you bring to it. But there's something so simple about a phrase like this. Particularly if it's been fortissimo all the way through that middle section. Obviously it would be different if you didn't. Would you just try as a coda from the D, as simple as possible, as if instead of being a French Catholic you were North German Lutheran? That's Okay, let's hold it all the way. Right, beautiful. Now do it one more time and do it even simpler. Imagine this was the last thing that was going to happen on Earth. Now, nothing again would ever happen except this was farewell. Very beautiful. And I want to say, first of all, thank you. Second of all, it's not a question of being right. In other words, it's just we look at these great pieces through whatever glasses we have available. We look through Schenker, we look through the French period, the similar period. We bring to bear whatever we know. And this has been a wonderful conversation. I promised it would be a conversation, and I think it was wonderful.
It was, thank you.
Yeah.
I will add my great chamber music teacher, Hortense Cartier-Bresson, that I love to talk about. She always told me, the day you realize you know nothing is the day you really became wise, because we're constantly learning.
How did you know Cartier-Bresson?
Hortense Cartier-Bresson was his niece, the niece of the great photographer. And she's the professor, so she's a pianist at the Paris Conservatory, but she was also my chamber music coach.
Oh,
so
that's a great name.
I was deeply impacted for 2 years.
Wonderful, so, great. David, go to your other job, and we're going to do some Shakespeare. The last half hour, we're going to do Shakespeare, and I'm very excited. But this was great. It was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Great.